Afternoon, everybody. That's not true. I'm not a FinTech journalist, sadly. I'm the CEE correspondent for Financial Times. So when I'm not writing about Polish politics, I'm writing about the innovation and entrepreneurialism going on in this whole region, not just Poland, but further south as well as east. Enough about me. We're very lucky today to hear from one of the leading lights in terms of investing in early stage FinTech products, financial services products. Last year, Forbes named him as one of the top global FinTech investors. He's put money into more than 50 companies, including Credit Tech and SixUp, and he's been involved in building the businesses of Hootsuite and most recently Honest Dollar, which was very recently just bought by Goldman Sachs. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce all the way from Silicon Valley, John Soberg. John. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
John, thanks for coming all this way. I mean, we just heard from the previous speaker about how FinTech is changing everything, changing the world. Can you talk a bit about how you've seen it do that in real terms and what it's changing on the ground?
I think, it is changing the world. I think the thing that I see that's most interesting and probably most promising around the world is the level of access that is happening today. So traditionally, banks have always, for example, lent to customers that they knew, that they understood, that had low risk and fit specific parameters that they were looking at. Today, you've got technology companies that are able to figure out if somebody's worth giving a loan to in 20 seconds. Credit Tech will give you a loan for 100 euros in 20 seconds and it'll be in your bank account in 10 minutes. Or if you don't have a bank account, it'll be at you can get it from a cash machine. So it's changing the game in terms of people who didn't previously have access to capital or to financial services to give them access.
And when you're thinking about putting money into a venture, a FinTech venture, what is it that sticks out for you? Are you looking for people that are disrupting the most? Are you looking for people that have seen gaps, people that have got tie-ins with incumbents? What's the...
I look at the team first. So for me, I always tell people I'll invest in 2 people and a dog if I really like the dog.
But or the people.
Or the people, but the dog's really important. In FinTech, there's a few different kind of things that I look for. I look for the team first, so the team has to be credible. They have to understand the markets that they're going into. The market itself is important. So typically in FinTech, everybody says, well, they're all big markets. And that's somewhat true, but I wouldn't say it's always true. You need to have companies, though, that understand how those markets work. So even though people are saying, that insurance is going to go away and change or banks won't be here, banks are very powerful institutions today, and they still do control most of the money.
Right.
And so even if you're a high-flying startup, you're typically a blip on the radar relative to the big banks.
Right.
So you need to keep that in mind, and you need to figure out how to play within the system. Otherwise, you're usually not going to make it.
And how are the big banks reacting, or how have you seen them react? I mean, are they looking to swallow up these blips on their radars? Are they looking to sort of copycat them, or are they dismissing them?
I think, the smart ones are paying attention, because even though I say that the banks have control over the money, if you fast forward, and you don't have to go that far, maybe 5 years, 10 years, it could change pretty dramatically. So the smart banks are engaging with new startups. They're paying attention to what's going on. Some of them, I just, like you mentioned, I sold a company, Honest Dollar, to Goldman Sachs. And the joke was that we might have to change the name of the company before we could sell it to Goldman Sachs. But this was interesting because Honest Dollar did low-cost retirement plans in the United States for people who couldn't afford to get a typical, like a 401k or a typical retirement plan. It's not a business Goldman Sachs has been in. So they're paying attention, seeing that this could be a big opportunity for them, and they bought this company.
Do you expect them to run it as it was run before, or sort of try and keep it quiet until that business market becomes important for them?
They published it all over when they bought it. So they're running it as a wholly owned subsidiary, and it's an Austin, Texas-based company. So now there's an office of Goldman Sachs in Austin, Texas that used to be the Honest Dollar office.
I'm sure the people of Austin, Texas are incredibly happy. When you look at the map, is it geographical in terms of where these startups are taking off, or is it completely international? I mean, and is it also about markets where maybe incumbents are more flabby or make more mistakes?
There's a combination of multiple factors. So it's international. One of the reasons that I spend so much time on planes is because I believe that great entrepreneurs can come from anywhere. So that is, and I've seen that. You can see amazing entrepreneurs coming from all over the world. But the second part of that is that they tend to gravitate towards centers of or ecosystems. So if you're a FinTech company, you tend to go where FinTech investors are, where channel partners are, where support is. So you go to London, you might go to New York, places like that. So you tend to see entrepreneurs can start in many places, but they often end up in others. And it's part of what Silicon Valley magic is too, is because a lot of companies, when they get big enough to scale to be really big, they end up coming over to Silicon Valley.
Right, right. I mean, Poland's very proud of itself as a leader in Europe in terms of smart banking and more fintech-esque ideas. There's a number of small banks here that are doing really quite innovative stuff. They win lots of awards. Will they face a challenge, do you think, that people in Silicon Valley just have a bigger infrastructure, ecosystem around them? Or do you think that smaller ideas from countries such as Poland, which isn't as well known on the innovation map, if you like, can they compete?
I think they can. I think often it's not direct competition anyway. You're hard pressed really to find, if you talk about some of the biggest name startups in fintech from the US, they're often not very international. Maybe in remittance or in a couple of businesses that are inherently international, you see that. But a lot of times what you see in Poland is like you said, the innovation is here. The fact that consumers are using these more advanced technologies is actually a great place for innovation and for startups to be operating. And then the ones that get bigger are the ones that scale across multiple countries from there. But often they're not competing with US companies.
Right. Can you talk a bit about some of your favorite investments in fintech and sort of what you learned from them, and then maybe some of the disasters and also the learnings?
Sure. I think I'm not supposed to have any favorites. So
of course,
that's one of the rules
it's
is
like
that
children.
all your children are good looking, right? But I will say, some of them have grown faster than others,
Sure.
so we could talk a little bit about that. One that's a good example that might actually be familiar to people here is a company called Creditech. It's based in Germany. Hamburg is where they started, but Poland was actually their first market.
Right.
Ironically, they were having trouble getting licenses to do lending in Germany, and so, in true pivoting fashion, as to use a Silicon Valley term, they went to Poland. And they've done pretty well. So they do high-risk lending in Poland, now in Spain, in Mexico, in
Right.
Australia. One of the things that's unique about Creditech is that they've built an underlying technology that uses data sources from just about anywhere. So they literally will look at how fast you type, how you type, as well as your financial information, as well as what's on your computer while you're doing this application.
Is that legal?
And so it is. Depends on where
In
you
Poland,
are.
but not in Germany.
Poland, but not in Germany. You see a lot more of this.
Right.
People are doing underwriting now based on Facebook profiles.
Sure.
And it's very powerful because looking at who your friends are tells an awful lot about your social circle and actually a lot about your wealth or a lot of your financial health.
That is insane.
Which is kind of insane, but it makes sense if you think about it logically.
Yeah. I should stop accepting all those friend requests, right?
Yes, it can have real ramifications.
And in terms of disasters, I mean, maybe examples of businesses that are just too far ahead of the curve, or
there's a timing issue always with startups, I think. Disasters. I've had several companies that I've had to, that have shut down. Often I would say, I don't have any that have spectacularly blown up that were, growing like crazy, and then all of a sudden they broke the law or something and they died. Sure. It's more usually what it is I tell people the CEO usually knows before I do that things aren't going very well, and so then you try to see if you can find a solution for them or sell the company, or maybe you end up shutting it down. And the disasters tend to be either that they didn't quite understand their market, and so they had trouble getting their customers, or I thought I was going to get 10,000 customers and I ended up getting 50. And if your idea doesn't work, you have to be smart enough to figure out what that market is, and you only have a certain amount of time before you run out of money.
There's a huge amount of buzz around fintech, and I think a lot of people use it without really understanding completely what it entails. I mean, do you worry a bit about a bubble around investment in the space?
I guess, yes. I would say the way I tell people is that there's way more noise for me now when I'm looking at investments because there's so many more companies that have been funded. I don't think it's a systemic risk in the grand scheme of things. What I think, unfortunately, is going to happen is a lot of the early stage startups that get funding are not going to make it.
Sure.
And so you're going to see, and then what that will do is that will slow down funding for the others. And so you'll see a kind of a lagging curve. After there's failure, then people decide to slow down on investment. Ironically, you actually should speed up probably because that's when the best ones are surviving. But people don't think that way, so they react the other way.
And isn't sort of the beauty of fintech is that these companies are small, they're nimble, they can get in the cracks that banks leave everywhere and into this sort of ecosystem. And if they get big and flabby, then they fail to be what they were set out to be, right? I mean.
I think so, although the part that's really tough is those nooks and crannies that people talk about are often harder to get into or to figure out than people might assume. It's true that you can get a beautiful mobile app that makes banking look wonderful, but depending on the country, some people just don't want to move their money anywhere. Right. And so it might be wonderful that they've got this cool app and everything else, but they don't really care. Other places that, you've got people that really love this app. And so the behaviors and the priorities of the customers are actually usually the most important driver. But if you do see some of these get real traction, then the banks will pay close attention. And you often end up then seeing those get that much bigger because then they get help and support.
Earlier you were talking about London being an international sort of hub, if you like, for fintech. I mean, to what extent is it sort of dominating the space and how did it get there?
I think London's actually a great example of collaboration between industry, government, private finance, entrepreneurship, mentorship. That ecosystem has moved really, really quickly in fintech over the past few years, and I think it's because of a concerted effort by many different parties. So, I've been telling people literally for the last 4 years that if you didn't pay attention to London and you're a fintech investor, you're in trouble because some of the better companies are coming out of London now. And you can't underestimate any one of those things. So, to have the financial regulator paying attention to startups and actually working with startups to make sure that the regulations are flexible enough or are enabling innovation is a huge deal. We don't get that in the US very much. And then having government support for different types of programs and things like that, that actually tends to drive the ecosystem, and then what you see is the flywheel gets going, and the private capital usually is a follower actually as opposed to a leader. So VCs tend to be, everybody thinks of us as the guys that are out in front, and we're always the people who are predicting the future. The reality is we're smart. If we're really smart, we're waiting for the smart entrepreneurs to tell us where the future is, and then we just find a way to ride their coattails.
It's interesting because there's obviously a lot of European countries at the moment, especially in this part of the world, who like to talk up their potential as an entrepreneur, startup hub. Well, I mean, a lot of governments are getting involved. Are there any dangers of too much government intervention in this kind of space?
Yeah, I do think so. I think government has if you look back, Silicon Valley was actually started by government programs that were driving innovation. I think government can play a key role in providing often early financing because, like I said, VCs like me tend to go to places where there are companies that have the chance to be really big. Sure. And usually at the very beginning of an ecosystem, the companies are not that evolved yet. The entrepreneurship is just not that sophisticated yet, and so it takes a little bit of time. But government can really lay the groundwork, and then by also helping to support bringing in more capital, bringing in events like this, getting people here to pay attention. All of those things can be a real critical piece. Government can also, some government programs actually are disincentives for private investors. There can be lots of ways that they can actually, in some ways, be detrimental to the growth of companies. So you have to watch that balance.
You've just moved on from a previous company to set up your own shop. I wonder if you could talk a bit about what you hope to do with that and where we might see you invest in the future.
Yeah, sure. So I was a partner at a fund called Bloomberg Capital before, and then I did a small fund recently. I'm now working on a new early stage FinTech focused fund that will be global. So again, I'm looking for 2 people and a dog if I like the team, basically. But one of the things that's unique about me from Silicon Valley is the fact that I do invest outside of the US.
Right.
So I always joke that a lot of people will fly over to a conference, but they leave their checkbook at home. But I'm actually one of those people that will be willing to invest outside of the US, and pretty substantially. Almost 50% of my investments have been outside of the US.
Right.
So I'm paying close attention, and so the fund will be focused there still. In terms of trying to help, and I do see huge opportunities for entrepreneurs that are going after markets that are not necessarily in the U.S.
I mean, I hope you brought your checkbook here, but Poland doesn't accept checks. Actually, it's so much more advanced over the
well,
US.
Sometimes I carry suitcases full of cash.
Well, that's welcome. And could we see you making investments in this part of the world? Is that something you're keen on?
Yeah, for sure. I spend quite a bit of time traveling, and part of the reason is that, because as I look at ecosystem development, it doesn't take very long these days. The same way it doesn't take long for companies to grow up, ecosystems can grow up really quickly, and there's huge amounts of talent here. There's a great market. There's a receptive market. If you look at even the banking sector here, it's small enough that the access is not that difficult. So the potential to build a really big and interesting company out of Poland is actually already here.
Right.
The ingredients are there, just as a matter of time for that to happen.
And just sort of to wrap it all up, I mean, you referred to the Goldman Sachs purchase. I mean, do you think the end game for most fintech companies that they want to be swallowed up by a big incumbent, or is it about getting so big they can challenge them and having their own tower in Canary Wharf? And
that's a great question. I would tell you this: I always look for entrepreneurs that want to be big enough to challenge the incumbents.
Right.
The odds of that happening are almost zero. But if I would tell you this: if somebody thinks that they want to build a company that's going to be a $25 million company, they're likely going to build one that's worth $5 million.
Right.
If they want to build $1 billion company, they're more likely to build something maybe worth 100 to 200, and that's a pretty darn good outcome.
Sure.
I think Vitaly said today that there's been 2 tech IPOs in the U.S. so far this year, and actually one of my companies is one that filed in December last year, so it's on the docket hopefully for this year.
Fantastic.
But the odds of becoming an IPO or getting to the point where you're going to challenge a Goldman Sachs as a startup are really, really low. So it's 90-some% M&A, I think.
And this is about changing the industry from the inside then, rather than trying to attack these guys?
I think so. If you think about generally in FinTech, the amount of capital that you would need to truly take on one of the big incumbents at this point is just astronomical.
Right.
So you often work with them.
And they might be the guys having to finance you. So.
Yeah, well, if to me, where banking may end up going is that you end up with a lot of technology platforms on the front end that are doing lending, that are doing banking, that are doing the interface with the consumer.
Right.
But banks end up being the financing channel in the back end behind them.
Sure.
And some of the smarter banks are already doing this in a big way. They're financing lending companies, they're financing payments companies. So banks are not stupid either. They're thinking about how they're going to fit into the ecosystem. So I think that's why I say that when I look at FinTech companies, understanding how they fit into that is actually really important, both for their growth and then for their potential exit.
Very good. Well, I look forward to hearing your next investment, and hopefully it will be in this part of the world. John, thank you very much. Thank you for you guys for listening.
Thank you.